Yes, okay. So anyway, coming back to like that nature versus nurture divide, and behavior genetics is very much on the nature front of things, and it is an evolving field, and the findings themselves are not what you would call 110% conclusive, right? Because obviously as the science of it as the technology piece of it evolves, what we are learning about genetic influences and transmission of genes is also evolving and changing. And at the same time, um, the expression of genes or the factors that that affect the expression of your genes is also evolving. And so there's something called small gene effects, which are innumerable and very hard to measure, which is why we can't say conclusively, for example, that depression is completely genetic. It's very hard to say. But we do know that yes, there is a relationship there, and there is a genetic component to depression as a inherited condition. But what makes it happen to a person can likely and usually is by a very traumatic or significant life experience that happens. And by significant, you have to consider it significant to the person in that context. Okay. So it doesn't always have to be what you might think is traumatic, because trauma itself is something that is, that word, right? It encapsulates a range of experiences. And so what we kind of figure is that, yes, behavior genetics is a very good way to figure out how much of us is coming from biology. And so far, what it's taught us, if I could, like, synthesize everything into one sentence, it would be that yes, absolutely, a large part of who we are, what we do, how we think, how we approach the world comes from our genetic makeup, from our DNA. But a large part of that also comes from the environment that we grow up in, the influences that we're exposed to, and those two kind of interact to produce who you are actually, right? Um, and of course, the one thing that does continue to change as you grow older is your environment. And as you grow older, along with your environment, your cognitive abilities change, your social emotional skills develop. And so you do continue to change, acted upon by the environment that you're surrounded by. So keep that in mind. We'll progress now. Um, right. So what we were talking about in the last class, and I think this is where we stopped, is that, well, why do we need to study the genetic information of different human beings? Why is it important for us to understand um, heritability, right? Or how much of a particular characteristic that we possess or a trait that we possess has been inherited? And we need to do this because it's important for us to understand what makes people different from each other, um, as well as what makes groups of people different from each other. And this is something, keep this thought in your mind as we go on, because it's something that we'll talk about in our next slide, which is coincidentally about twin studies. So remember, we want to figure out, right, what is the role of biology and what is the role of environment, and what better to do that with, or how better to do that than by studying twins, because essentially twins, especially, well, monozygotic twins, which is twins that are formed from the same egg. Monozygotic, mono is one and zygotic refers to egg. So monozygotic, sorry, cell. Identical twins have the exact same genetic information, whereas for fraternal or dizygotic twins, di meaning two, which are not identical, that's what fraternal means, they have at least 50% of the same genetic information as each other. So what better way to understand the role of biology than by studying these amazing samples? And there are these amazing, incredible twin studies happening all over the world. So a lot of times researchers have just simply used government mechanisms to figure out how many twins are in the population, and then they look at factors like income, demographics, basically, They'll look at education levels, and from that they'll infer heritability, right? So for instance, a study in Minnesota, which has like 14,000 twins enrolled in it, and they've been studying those twins since 1989. And so the database keeps growing, and they have all this longitudinal data. And the purpose for them to look at twins is to see, okay, well, for example, let's take a characteristic like extroversion, right? And interestingly, within the field of personality, emotional traits have been the ones that have been seen to have a lot of commonality between twins. So assume that we're looking at extroversion in two sets of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins. We're looking at this and we figure that, well, these 100% same genetic makeup, these identical twins, they share extroversion to about, they're both, let's say, assume like 4 out of 5 on extroversion. And then we look at the dizygotic twins, and one of them is maybe a 2 on 5 and the other one is a 3 on 5, but they still share extroversion as a quality in a very similar level. It's not exactly the same, right? What that essentially tells us is that in the 100% same genetic information, this is a trait that clearly has a lot of biological factors associated with it because it's so similar. The levels of extroversion are so similar in identical twins that looks like it has to be inherited. On the flip side, even in dizygotic twins, where 50% of that genetic information is shared, or at least 50% of that genetic information is shared, you see that again, there is some connection because even they have a similar level of extroversion. It's not as similar as that of identical twins, but there is a similarity there, right? And so that is what shows you the genetic component of this particular trait of extroversion. And the interesting thing is that a lot of, and they can't do it anymore, but this study that you see about Jim Lewis and Jim Springer, this was a sort of an accidental study. It was like a once in a lifetime sort of a case where there were these two twins, and I mentioned this to you briefly in our last class. Two twins born in the US, separated at birth. One is in the US, one moves to, I think, Europe or the UK. So there's Jim Lewis, Jim Springer, growing up in adoptive families, different continents, don't even know the other exists. At the age of 39, they're reunited randomly, chance of fate, whatever. And in this reunion, it's discovered that they have similarities that range from, they both bite their fingernails down to like the nub, to their preferences. They're both married women named Linda. They had both named their child the same name, and they didn't even know that the other person existed until they were 39 years old. Now imagine, completely different family environments, don't know about each other, but still they grew up into such similar life trajectories, or such similar people in terms of their tastes, in terms of their preferences. And we can't do those kinds of studies anymore because adoption agencies don't break up twin pairs anymore. But what if you think about it, two men don't know the other exists, yet so similar, also identical twins, right? So sharing the exact same genetic information. That tells us that a large part of who we are can possibly be genetic, right? Can be inherited. So Sharik, I'm going to come to this question later that you asked about evolution. So anyway, so that's why twin studies are super important, right? Imagine what this, just like this small example of Jim and Jim shows us. I mean, they both married the same named woman. They were both, I think, divorced or single by the time they met. They both had named their son James. One named him James Lewis and one named James Allen. They both had their sons named by two names, James Allen, which is really fascinating. The only difference was they spelled Allen differently. That's it. And again, they had never spoken to each other, didn't know the other existed. So really random. So you kind of see that there's value in comparing these, in comparing sets of twins, as well as seeing the differences between a particular pair, or within, sorry, a particular pair. That's why we do twin studies, just to understand the influence of genes. This I literally just talked about how extroversion, neuroticism are much more common, levels of them are much more common in identical twins as opposed to fraternal twins. And again, like I also mentioned, within personality, this is the emotional traits of personality are found to be occurring very on the same level with identical twins as opposed to fraternal or non-identical twins. Now, we've talked about the genetics of it, right? Like, oh, if you're a twin, you have the same genetic information. But now think about the role of the environment. So think about what I just told you about these two Jims born in different countries, you know, completely different environments, family environments, went to different schools, literally like were exposed to different dialects in terms of language. And yet they became the same. But then the question becomes, well, does the environment have no impact, right? Like, what is the role of the environment then? So that's something I need you to think about. Should we stop thinking about the environment as important to our considerations or not? And I'm not just talking about the gym case, because again, that's fascinating, but it's also, you know, an outlier. It's like a one-off. So many people raising their hands. Let's go with, I want Sadaf, then Laiba, then Ramin, then Ali. So you can
Okay.
unmute yourself. And, yeah.
Yeah, so the environment is very important when it even comes to, like studying something like biological predeterminism. It's because the impact the environment actually has on our bodies like continuously. So even though we might have, for example, I'll just give an example, like to be obese, like if we have some genetic hereditary material for us to be obese, but the person actually does not eat enough nutrition. It's just an example how our environment is going to influence the genes we already have. So that's why it's very important to study the two together when it comes to biological predeterminism or studying genes and the effect of psychology on them.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, that's a good. Obesity is actually a very good example because of, again, like you rightly pointed out, that it does occur. There is a hereditary element to it. So that's a, yeah, that's good. But that's also an example that's very focused on like biology itself, like pure biology, pure genetics or biogenetics. And I would encourage you to think more in terms of the psychological realm, since that's what our course is about. So think about that, right? All right. So who was next? I think it was Laiba. If you had your hand raised, then just go ahead and just talk because I just said all the names.
Miss, it was actually almost the same point, but then I would like to add one more thing that as you were talking about earlier, like okay, the study, the twins were met when they were 39. So basically, what happens is that when it comes to behavior genetics and when it comes to environment, basically environment is important. It really impacts, but similarities or जो genetics होते definitely वो कभी भी change नहीं होते, we cannot change the genetics and stuff. So environment does impact definitely, we cannot ignore that, but genetics कभी change नहीं होते. So I think yes, I mean it changes the behavior, but genes वाला behavior कभी भी मतलब वो आप similarity भी किसी और वे में जरूर apply करते हो आप उसको, environment change होने की वजह से किसी और वे में जरूर apply
Yeah, good. When the environment changes, you may change with it. You will adapt to it, possibly, or not, right? Or not. So keep that in mind. All right, who is next?
Hi. So I just wanted to ask that when we're considering twin studies, it's also important to consider the ages of those particular like sets of twins, right? Because if you're going to study like 5 or 7 year old children who live together, then undoubtedly there's going to be so much like overlap in the way they're socialized and stuff. Versus if we consider like college age twins who are in different like states or countries or whatever, they eventually are going to have had like different levels of exposure to different factors. So there the environmental influence is going to vary a lot more, and then we can obviously see what aspects are more biological. I also wanted to ask that when things that can't like overtly be attributed to genes in twins, they when they show variation, can it like automatically be assigned to the environment, or can it be like a possibility that there's a variation among like certain other genes that can express themselves differently across individuals?
Okay. So your first question, or rather comment, is that it doesn't make sense to study twins at a set point in time. There's a limitation to how much you can get out of that, which you're absolutely right about, which is why twin studies are longitudinal. So they span over many years actually. And so remember, I was telling you about this Minnesota study that has like 14,000 people enrolled in it, and it's been in practice since 1989. People are constantly being added to that database. So when twins are born, they get kind of registered as part of that study's data, and hence the researchers can always approach those twins and then engage with them over extended period of time. So that's the first one. And your second question, sorry, can you repeat the second one for me?
Yeah, so if like twins show variation, if identical twins show variation in certain aspects that aren't like necessarily completely biological, so can we attribute those directly to the environment, or can it be like a difference in like smaller genes?
It can be either. It can be either, right? And that's why we can't absolutely and conclusively give a causal effect of genes, because it's hard to measure all of those small gene effects that you referred to, as opposed to also the environment. And then we also know that the environment can leave epigenetic markers which affect the expression of the genes themselves. Some of these epigenetic markers can actually be transmitted before a baby is even born. Just something like maternal nutrition will affect that. So I think in your book also there's an example of the Dutch famine, where all these children born during this time, where the mothers didn't have access to nutrition, displayed a very high incidence of mental disorders, not limited to, but including schizophrenia and depression. So you kind of think about that as well, right? And so why did that happen? The mothers were healthy and they did not have any sort of mental illness, but their children did. And so the theory was that the lack of nutrition during their pregnancy, right, in the prenatal stage, is what contributed to this happening. And because of certain epigenetic markers that were left by that hunger, by that starvation. Um, Sorry. Okay. Who is next?
I wanted to say, it's okay if, talking about the question that you asked, that, the above mentioned study does, like, what does it tell it about the effects of the environment and genes? So I want to say that a study like this, they studied thousands of twins, and it shows that, identical twins are much more likely to be similar in their tastes, extrovertedness. It doesn't necessarily prove that environment is not important, because it shows that, okay, genes are important, but doesn't show that environment is not important. Like, what if we conducted a study where, like, they're different people, but they are they grew up in the same environment, in exactly the same environment, with exactly the same situations. So what if they started to show more similarities, and which is the case. For example, people who live in the same neighborhood, for example, have a very similar taste when it comes to food or music. People live in the same country, have very similarities. So it does show that the environment is also important, as this study shows that genes are also important. It doesn't necessarily disprove that environment is not important or it doesn't play an effect.
Yes, thank you. That's very important and a very, very good, astute observation. If I'm not wrong, yours was the last name I took in the list. Or
Yes.
yeah, okay. So you guys, can you pause for a second? People who have your hand raised. Okay. So coming back here, wow, you guys are going crazy on the chat. I'm gonna let you talk to each other. So again, just bringing you back, and I think this sort of is in line with what a lot of you have mentioned already, that number one, you can't completely disregard the environment just because, yes, there is shared genetic information, because it is actually the environment that can impact and does impact the expression of genes, right? So genes will remain, sorry, certain genes will remain inactive unless triggered, unless activated. And that activation comes primarily, predominantly, completely from the environment. And so, but that being said, what's important to remember is also that the same environment will not affect two people within it in the exact same way. So, your interpretation, for example, of your parents will be different, perhaps, than your siblings' interpretation of something that your parents are saying or doing, right? Um, and you live in the same home, you have the exact same parents, you probably went to the same schools, but still the way that you're making sense of things is different, right? And so each and every one of us has a very different lived experience. That's the most unique thing about human beings, that we experience the world very differently. Um, and that just thinking about that tells you that yes, the environment does have an impact and it interacts with your genetics, but um, that impact can be very different for different people, even if it is the same environment, which you see in a study. For example, if you study two twins, let's say identical twins in the exact same home environment, you would still find differences. Just because identical twins are similar does not mean they are the same person, right? And so those differences come from the environment itself. Second, on the other hand, if you were to study two identical twins who were in completely different environments, you would still see some similarities. So why do we do it then? Like, what do you get out of that? You learn that, of course, and in psychology, we acknowledge the impact that your childhood experiences have on how you develop and who you become. But at the same time, um, if you know, and this is something I've said to you from the beginning, that you cannot reduce it down to just biology. You cannot also simply reduce it down to environment, but we do want to understand what are the factors, biological factors, and what are the environmental factors that optimize human development, right? Um, and when we have looked at that time and time again, one of the most important factors in the environment has been parenting. So later on, we're going to do a little bit of attachment theory as well, which you learn more about this sort of impact of parenting, or the absence of parenting, and how that influences who you become. But for now, just remember that parenting is one of the most significant factors in the environment that has an impact on the expression of whatever your genetic information is. Number one, because when you're born, that is your primary caregiver. Your parents are the people that you're exposed to the most often in those first few years of your life, which is also when your brain is at its most rapid point of development. Second, the when you are born, temperament is the one thing that has been found to be genetic, pre-coded within you. Okay, and temperament here refers to how intensely reactive you are on an emotional level. Are you highly reactive which would imply that you react to everything, to smallest stimuli. You're sensitive to stimuli, and your reactions are intense, they're very charged. If you're on the low reactive side, then you don't really react to every single thing. And when you do respond, those responses are not very intense or as intense as they would be for somebody who's highly reactive. Now, imagine this. That there's a highly reactive baby, which means the infant responds to everything. And again, those responses are extremely charged responses. If the parent or the primary caregiver is unable to manage a child with a temperament like that, which we call a lack of attunement, if that happens, then there are going to be issues for that child because the child's needs are not being met, okay, in some way or form. And when the child's needs are not being met, there is going to be some lasting emotional sort of, I'm not going to say damage because that's a very charged word, but there will be an impact on the emotional development of this child. And again, when we do attachment theory, it'll make more sense. But for your current purposes, this genetic component of your temperament, right? How responsive you are, how sensitive you are to the environment, this interacts simply, very simply, just with your parents' temperament and results in producing the environment that you are raised in, especially in those first few years of your life, beyond language, right? Before language itself. Keep that in mind. Okay, so Jyoti, and then Sharik.
Miss, I just have a question that when you mentioned temperament of the babies, that it is genetically encoded. So when some of the babies cry a lot when they're infants, and some babies do not cry that much. So is that a portrayal of their temperament that the babies who cry a lot more are more active than the babies who do not cry at all or cry very less?
Yeah, yeah.
Really
Crying
cool.
is exactly, yes, absolutely. Crying is a is the expression of reactivity. You're right. Yeah. Okay, Sharik and then Zoya.
Okay, so you said that our perception or our interpretation of our experiences affects who we are. So does the perception come from our genes or is it learned, like primary socialization, how our parents bring us up?
So in perception, I'm talking about how you understand it. Okay, in psychology, perception refers to something else. So I just want to clarify. Um, but yes, I am very much referring to the fact that how you make meaning of the world impacts who you are. Now, the how you make meaning of the world is, yes, partly coming from the norms and values that you are taught, right? These are the right behaviors to have, these are things to do. And when we talk about child development, a large part of who we become is informed by these norms and values that we are taught through socialization, like you said. However, what we do with that information, right? Um, I mean, you may choose to reject a norm that you were taught when you were little as you grow up. And that's your own capacity for independent thought that's acting, right? And where does that capacity for independent thought come from? It comes from your cognition, and your cognition is here, right? But again, how critically you can think about, or the qualitative nature of your cognition, that depends very much on intelligence, which is inherited. Sorry. Sorry. So yeah, your intelligence is inherited. So part of it comes from that. Does that answer your question?
So if someone is rebellious by nature, it could be genes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, it does answer the question. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Zoya.
So you had mentioned that if a child's needs are not met, then it has long-lasting effects. So is that similar to Freud's fixation of developmental stages?
Yes and no. Uh, yes and no, because Freud's the nature of the childhood experiences that Freud referred to were completely sexual experiences. Whereas when we talk about child development in a broader discourse, we talk about a lot more than just the sexuality or sexual orientation of children, or, we talk about a lot more than gender identity. There's a lot more involved. So I would say Freud's view is very reductionist, but the similarity is that, yeah, okay, childhood experiences have an impact on you, right? But that's something that you can also say is just common sense. So that's what I would say. I want to clarify on the chat that you guys are asking questions about changes in temperament. So temperament has been found to be very stable across the lifespan, which means that actually, no, it does not change. However, if you are a highly reactive person, what does happen is that as you grow older, you hopefully are taught strategies for self-regulation. When you learn self-regulation, you kind of keep your reactivity managed. So the actual essence of it is not something that will change, but the expression of it absolutely can change. All right. Okay. Sorry. So again, talking so much about this is inherited, that is inherited. We were just talking about the intelligence as an inherited trait or characteristic of human beings. And what we know now is that, yes, there is general intelligence that is inherited, okay, that is pre-coded, that is in the human genome. However, we do not know how much of the difference, we do not know how much of the difference in intelligence between two people is coming from the genes. We do know that the intelligence between group X and group Y is different because of genes, but it's hard for us to point that out to individual differences, like between individuals, exactly how much of their difference in intelligence is because of their genetics and how much of it is because of their environment. We don't know this. Okay. So again, the reason we can do it for a group but not between two individuals is because in a group setting, you can more easily disregard those small gene effects, because again, you're looking at a larger data set, and your findings, your inferences from what you find can be more legitimate, because when you're looking at a larger group, you generalize certain things in your findings. So that's there. Again, I think you guys have already thought through the question here about environmental influences on intelligence. But think about the fact that, for example, in our country, we have large portion of our population that is classified as illiterate, okay? Our adult population, we say it's illiterate. But with these so-called illiterate adults, you go and you buy something from, let's say, someone who is an adult but is classified as illiterate, they can still do the calculations. They can still give you your change back. They'll tell you, okay, this is for this much. Okay, I'll give you 10% off, whatever, right? Why are they being able to do this math if they're illiterate, right? Even if they're illiterate as classified by our census measures, that does not necessarily mean the same thing as not having intelligence, right? Because general intelligence is not just about being able to read the theory of Freud. General intelligence is also what helps us really function adaptively in the world, make sense of the environment. It is essential to have a certain level of general intelligence, right? Just to be able to know, for instance, that if I do this, it's gonna hurt. That's also general intelligence, you know. Just being able to pull a door open instead of pushing it to open it is general intelligence as well. So just something to remember. Ali.
I wanted to point out, like, I think intelligence की जहाँ तक बात है, we can say that, it can also be sort of a gene that is there in a person, in an individual, but it will never be active until it's, activated by a certain environment. I mean, people can have, some hidden gifts, but unless, we, give them a particular environment, they won't show in a person. So, and also that's what I wanted to say, I guess.
Okay. So it's kind of like, you will always have that capacity for analytical reasoning. But what you're saying is that unless you're given an environment to practice that capacity, it doesn't become more complex. If that's what you're saying, you're right. That essence is there, but you need the right conditions to challenge it so that it develops into its highest possible form. So if that's what you're saying, you're right. And then Sharik, you had something to say as well.
How does psychology measure intelligence, and how do they make a connection between intelligence and genes? Like, what are
I
the
want to
methods?
hold on to that thought because we have an entire class on intelligence, and in that we're going to study different theories of intelligence, what intelligence actually means, what are the problems with standardized tests, and why they don't actually measure intelligence at all. So we'll talk about all of that, but just hold that because today we're not getting into intelligence in depth. Okay, just understand that there is a genetic component to intelligence. That's all you need to take away today. Okay. Okay, so already talked about this. Now, this is an interesting little diagram. It's exactly from your textbook, and it just simply shows you the ways in which the environment can act on you. And so right here, you see this is a genetic code for a baby. Now, in the prenatal stage, this baby is exposed to drugs, toxin, lack of nutrition, stress. And this particular little diagram is for an infant being born to a mother who is addicted to drugs, right? And you're seeing this sort of trajectory right now on the screen. So you see in the prenatal stage, the infant is exposed to stress, maybe is exposed to toxins because of the mother's drug use, lack of nutrition as well. Postnatal, after the child is born, there's parental neglect. There may potentially be some abuse, and also the child may be bounced around from one to the other house, foster care, whatever, doesn't have a stable home environment. At the juvenile stage, which is when you're about between 11 to 15, 16, 17, whatever. At that point, the child is exposed to complex environments where he or she may not necessarily have the necessary skills to adapt optimally. There may also be issues with social relationships because, again, remember, this kid has not had a stable home environment. And at the end of the day, that's what helps you deal with social situations like school or college, right? And so anyway, and then as an adult, what you see is that this kid has now issues with pretty much critical thinking, does not have a very healthy lifestyle, has continued issues with nutrition. And this sort of just circle back now to the prenatal stage and then trace this development, this trajectory down. What you're seeing is that original genetic information now has this marker, this epigenetic marker as this. And remember, I told you trauma is something that you can't define in one word or one sentence. Trauma is very multifaceted, it's very complex. So even this at the prenatal stage and the postnatal stage, what was happening to this child very much qualifies as trauma. And it is consistent, lasting trauma that continues until this child becomes an adult, right? This sort of actually, these experiences are called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And in the US, ACEs is used as there's a questionnaire that they use on children to determine the level of ACEs that a child has experienced, to determine how at risk this child is for future problems in terms of academic outcomes or social outcomes or both. And if this kid needs help, then to help that child. But anyway, point is that these traumas have expressed themselves at the end of the day by altering the expression of this child's genetic information as the child becomes an adult. And this epigenetic marker could result in maybe, the incidence of depression or substance abuse, or and substance abuse would be, I think, very likely because A, there's genetic component to that, and secondly, these life experiences point towards triggering something like that. So again, something to think about when we think about how complex this interaction of the environment and our genetics is. So epigenetic means in addition to, right? Interesting thing about epigenetic markers is, number one, you can have them present before you're even born. Okay. Number two, if you have an epigenetic marker, that can possibly be reversed. It cannot always be reversed, but epigenetic marker can be reversed. Something to hold in our minds. And when we start to consider that our genes, sorry, 1 second. When we start to consider that our genes are impacted by the environment, but also the expression of our genes is further, and how is it impacted by the environment, right? Our genetic expression. Epigenetics is our one biggest answer, that these markers that influence the very actions of our genes and the instructions as genes carry out or don't carry out is through epigenetics. So they kind of give us the chemistry of certain elements of human behavior, right? And that's something cool to think about. But again, you cannot just focus on the chemistry without thinking about how the external factors have evolved that particular chemistry. So keep those two together. Okay. All right. I have already talked about how we can't really compress trauma into one sentence or one word, but as you can tell, trauma is life altering. It will change your life. We've also talked about genetic transmission of trauma and what that looks like in the, I think, the last class. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in a nutshell, the expression of your genes is altered by the environment, and extreme trauma can be inherited from one generation to the next. At the same time, important to bear in mind, the expression of that inherited genetic trauma varies, because if you are in an environment where your inherited trauma persists and the ways in which your house is or your primary caregivers raised you, the culture, norms, values of the community of your family are such that they make sure that you respond in the same way as if that trauma was still occurring, or if that traumatic situation is actually still occurring, right? Think about babies born into war zones who live their early childhood years, potentially maybe even up until adulthood, in war zone situations. Obviously, in those situations, the epigenetic markers as well as expression of genes, everything really is exacerbated because the environment is not a protective or supportive one. The environment is one that is an at-risk environment in and of itself. So you have to think about that as well, right? So don't boil it down to just one thing. Do not run the risk of determinism in your thoughts. Don't become an environmental determinist, or don't become a biological determinist. Don't reduce the causes or the effects down to just one or the other, right? Because they exist in a symbiotic relationship. And so you also need to consider that relationship, which is why you're studying this, right? Now, finally, very favorite part is evolutionary psychology. So if you don't know what the theory of evolution is, in a nutshell, the theory of evolution posits that we become, or we survive as a human race because of a process called natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which Mother Nature herself only lets those survive who have the traits that they need to adapt to the environment. So dinosaurs, for example, became extinct. Evolution says dinosaurs became extinct because They did not have the traits they needed to adapt to the changing nature of the world, and that is why they became extinct and they died out. Human beings, or Homo sapiens, on the other hand, have survived for millennia because human beings have continued to adapt, and now as we exist as humans, we are the finest version of Homo sapiens that have ever existed. And that's what the evolutionary psychologists would also think about, that the brain as it exists today is the most complex form that it has ever had. And the reason is largely, ironically, environmental, but also it's the survival of the fittest. So if you do not have the skills needed to survive or the tools needed to survive, you will not survive. So it's almost like a race. Actually, it is a race. Okay. And the stuff that doesn't help you survive, that doesn't add value to your potential for survival, is the stuff that is eliminated through natural selection. Okay, only the traits that help you survive are the ones that are transmitted from one generation to another generation. A. B. Only the most fitted for survival will survive. Okay, and by fitted, well fitted, I mean the people who have the traits that are, or the species that have the traits that enable them to keep, to manage the demands of the environment, with the understanding that the demands of this environment continue to change. Hence, human beings, if we are said to have survived over millennia, must be extremely adaptive, right? Flexible with the environment. Adaptiveness is pretty much what helps us survive. Now, when we talk about evolutionary psychology, we are looking at those psychological structures that have helped us survive over these millennia. All right? So, fear, for instance, is a shared human experience. Joy, shared human, not joy actually, but happiness, shared human experience, right? Anger, shared human experience, but also as emotions, these are adaptive emotions. They help us survive. Briefly, what does fear do? Fear prevents you from acting. It makes you cautious. It makes you hesitate. It makes you think about what you're getting into and what you're about to do. And you assess it just in terms of how much threat there is to your survival. At its most primal level, that's what fear does. So fear helps you survive. Anger also helps you survive because anger is evoked in response to a threat, right? Happiness, why does happiness help you survive? Because if you only experience fear and anger on the spectrum of being alive, you're not a very adaptive person. Simply because happiness comes from the release of particular neurotransmitters, as you've already studied. Maintaining a balance, right? So these three primal core human experiences of anger, joy, anger, happiness, and fear together give you that human experience, but also help you survive. If you're angry all the time, you're not going to make it very far, or not well, at least. Now, you know what I was telling you about general intelligence, how certain things automatically you know to do or not to do, right? So general intelligence, or evolutionary psychology would explain this in this way. If you're standing on top of a really high roof, yeah, and you're standing at the edge, even if you're about to bungee jump, which means you're willingly going to jump, you still hesitate to do it, right? And automatically, when you're walking in a dark room, automatically you're like cautious and you're kind of like feeling around. Those instinctive responses that you have, right? Not wanting to jump or not wanting to bump into something, or just intuitively being sort of conscious of your environment and the potential threats that it has. That's what evolutionary psychologists would argue we have inherited over millennia, and that's what has helped us survive, right? Fear of the dark is another one. And I'm pretty sure that in, I think, another 50 years, we're going to be finding a lot of effects of coronavirus also in these ways in 50, 100 years, because for sure, this is literally threatening human survival, this particular disease. So it would be really interesting to see what evolutionary psychologists come up with. But coming back to your class, basically, evolutionary psychologists simply want to know what are the psychological structures, the traits that have helped human beings survive, based on the assumption that the traits, the characteristics that optimize a human's chances for survival are the ones that are passed down over one generation to the next, and that those that are not optimal for survival are selected out. Okay, that's all you kind of need to understand right now at this point. All right, Sharik, you've raised your hand.
Okay, so I understand how evolution has brought about emotions and instincts, but has the increasing complexity in our brain also made us more prone to or susceptible to mental illnesses? Because if we think about it, emotions do play a big role in our mental illnesses, like fear is related to anxiety and sadness is related to depression. So did these mental illnesses not exist before, and has it come about because of evolution? And also, when we talk about the survival of the fittest, the people who are more prone to mental illness is called weak as opposed to those who can't.
People prone to what?
The people who are prone to mental illnesses, right? In terms of survival of the fittest, are they the ones who are weak, or will they be the who will be like removed from nature? If that
Okay.
makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I get it. So really quickly, in response to your first question about mental illness being not like, you have to consider that a lot of mental illness is also produced by context and culture. Okay, so a lot of what is labeled as a mental illness is contextual, in the sense that if 150 years ago, um, generalized anxiety was manifested as hysteria, today we know it's generalized anxiety, right? Or panic attack. 150 years ago, that's not what it was called. It was called a fit. Okay. So there's one example. Another example could be that just in 2013, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disease, which we use as a checklist, and we'll talk about this when we do mental illness in detail, but that's a manual that you use to diagnose particular mental illnesses, psychological disorders. That manual removed a complete disorder from it. That disorder is called Asperger's. Asperger's is where it's a form of, it's on the autism spectrum, but by removing it completely, they're basically saying it doesn't exist, but actually it does exist. So all those symptoms are there, but it's gone. It's gone from the manual, so it won't be diagnosed. It'll be diagnosed as something else, as something being on the spectrum, but not as Asperger's. So it's so cultural, it's so context driven, the definitions of psychological illnesses, that it's hard to say, in answer to your question, how much of it is coming from natural selection, because you kind of need to think about the nature of those illnesses as well, right? So yes. All right, now, how fast does natural selection happen? This really, really interesting study, it went on for so many years, and these guys just studied foxes. And I think it was in, I think they did this whole thing in, I think it was in Australia. This study is cited in Australia. I've forgotten a little bit about where, but basically this man, Believ, he started it, and Truth was his research assistant kind of thing. And when he died, she took over the study, and they started breeding foxes. And they started seeing how those foxes, they wanted to understand how those foxes would evolve if they were. So their first question was that if we create particular conditions, will we see a change in the nature of these foxes? And that condition that they chose was, okay, we want foxes to no longer be scared of human beings. Let's see if that can be done, right? Because they were like, okay, if foxes are no longer going to be afraid of humans and they can be domesticated and they can be kept as pets. So there was also this sort of like a humane element to it, right? This love of animals element to it. And so what they saw was that strangely, just by the fourth generation, the foxes they were breeding no longer demonstrated fear of humans. Um, think about particular dog breeds in this respect that have been bred to be household pets, right? That also shows you natural selection in progress. Well, of course, it's not natural because it's like created by an artificial environment, but it does tell you how we adapt to the environment, right? All beings adapt to the environment. All beings. Stray dogs adapt to the environment. Why are they so fearful? Why do they bark so much? Because the environment has taught them that human beings will hit them, kill them, shoot them, and leave them to die. Which is a sad truth of living in our country where we can't even take care of animals, let alone humans. But sorry, sore point for me. So anyway, point is that the question that evolutionary psychologists want to answer is based on the assumption that, number one, human beings are adaptive, which means they change with the changing demands of their environment. And that is why the human race has survived and continues to survive. All right. And so evolutionary psychologists have also found, for example, that you remember when we were studying the brain and I told you there are certain structures that are known as the ancient or the oldest structures of the brain, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, they've always sort of been in our brains. Whereas, let's say even the frontal lobe responsible for planning, decision making is one of the oldest structures in the brain. Sorry, somebody, can you just give me 2 minutes? It's 9:45. Sorry, just 1 second. I'll be back in 1 minute. In a random turn of events, somebody has come to my house at this time of day. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Sorry, what I was just bringing together for you was that evolutionary psychologists have found that these ancient structures of the brain, and moreover, evolutionary psychologists have compared the human brain to the chimpanzee brain, and now refer back to that 0.6% difference between the human brain and the chimpanzee brain. Chimpanzees are just as adaptive as human beings. And it's interesting because there's so much evolution as a theory is so controversial. And there's so much, there's obviously a religious side to it as well. But in the scientific field itself, also evolution is very highly debated. I personally think it does make a lot of sense to me, given what I've studied about it. There's like a couple of different approaches. One is where you look at the brain as a modular structure. So you look at each module and then you find how particular modules in the human brain, for instance, are similar to the same modules or functions in the chimpanzee brain. And over time, right, they compare also things like skulls over time, which is phrenology, not super reliable, but has given us something just to support that, yes, absolutely, evolution, A, happens, B, it is the process by which we have managed to survive. And here by we, I mean not just human beings, but different types of animals, breeds, so on and so forth, while others have died out and become extinct. All right, so I'm gonna get to this in our next class. I'm gonna have to stop now, but yeah, sorry. I have to stop now, but do you have any last pressing concerns? Yes, Aisha.
Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. So I just want to ask that who is the TA for the second slot? Can you please confirm?
That's such a good question. I'm still looking. I'm still looking for, but it's possible that Safa might end up being the TA for the second slot as well. But Safa and I need to figure out some logistics. But again, I have interviewed a few more students, but having some trouble still. So sorry about that. So Safa will just help you out until I find someone. All right, Ali and Vanya.
Sorry, yeah.
I wanted to ask the evolutionary psychology. One of the implications of this theory can be, somebody claiming racial superiority over another race. They can claim, that us living in this portion of the world for such a long period of time, our race or our group of people have evolved farther or more advanced than this other group. And I think this is one of the arguments that these racists actually make. So am I going in the right direction? Is this one of the implications?
Yeah, it's absolutely one of the implications. In fact, eugenics, which is psychology's dark and racist history, was an entire branch in psychology devoted to proving that people of color were at a lower level than white people. Very simple. Yeah, that's, yeah.
I had another question, sorry.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, sorry.
Okay, it's all right.
Miss,
Ali, email me. Yes.
Yeah. When you mention natural selection, we're talking about, taking in factors or taking out factors, which, um, may help people sort of live, I don't know, like better in the society, something like that. Isn't that like similar to the process of using negative and positive reinforcements and negative and positive punishments? So would that be like some sort of like instant way or to actually achieve that situation, and then natural selection after continuous courses of positive and negative reinforcements, or is that different?
Okay, it's not the same thing because natural selection implies survival. Okay, survival, not, it's not about better or worse, it's about surviving. So that's my first response. And the second thing is that I don't think, sorry, can you repeat that last question again?
Yeah, so I said that can you achieve natural selection through courses?
Conditioning, yes. Sorry, you asked about the relationship. Basically, if you can condition natural selection, I think is what you're asking. And no, you cannot. And we'll study this when we talk about behaviorism. But one of the problems with behaviorist theory is that the responses that you condition some people into, i.e., avoidance of some behaviors or adoption of some behaviors, is not a sustainable or lasting necessarily change, especially when the factors that you introduce, the negative or the positive reinforcements, are removed. You do see a lot of times that those responses that you've tried to create will die out. The only time where they kind of become entrenched is where they are learned and more deeply learned and reflectively learned. Right, where intrinsic motivation to actually avoid or adopt a behavior is present, basically. Natural selection is absolutely compatible with self-actualization. There's one question on repeating temperament and heritability. Once again, your temperament is something that is called the genetic component of your personality. Your temperament is related to how sensitive you are to stimuli and how intensely you react to that stimuli. And it is absolutely something that is partially inherited because it is genetic. It does not change much over your lifespan. Temperament is the most stable component of personality. All right. So personality is temperament, reactivity levels, right? High or low, plus traits, characteristics, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, conscientiousness, diligence. These are 3 of the big 5 personality traits. All right, I'm going to stop now. Sorry to run, but I do need to run. I'll see you guys on Wednesday, inshallah, in person. It would be cool if a lot of you showed up, because I think if like attendance in person continues to drop, my motivation to be there in person is also going to drop. It's not happening so far with you guys. It's happening with a different course I teach, but I just want to let you know, all right? So I'll see you in person on Wednesday, and good luck. Happy Monday. Have a good week. All right. Bye-bye.